All right. Well, now it looks like a good portion of our attendees are already settled in. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started with our program. Welcome. I'm Jo Supranaw, the Director for Academic Engagement, and this is the Forever Learning Institute. In our session today, we're going to be looking behind the machine at AI, algorithms, and bias. And I'm joined today with Jeff Ward, who is a double Duke alum. He is also the Associate Dean for Technology and Innovation and a clinical professor of law with Duke Law School. And he's the director of the Duke Center on Law and Technology. Welcome to the Forever Learning Institute, Jeff.
Thanks so much for having me, Jo. Appreciate it. Well, I want to say thank you again to Jo and to Kim and everybody with the Forever Learning Institute team for putting this together. And not only this session, but really this whole series, which I've been particularly excited about. The prior session as part of this series on artificial intelligence, real ethical quandaries. This series really couldn't be more relevant or exciting for me. It's exactly the kinds of things that I ask my students to think about in my Frontier AI and Robotics class, Law and Ethics, in my Law and Policy lab on data governance, and really in a lot of the work that we do through the center. And I know that's true of many of our guests today on our panel. They ask their students to do the same kinds of inquiry. It's even the subject of the painting behind me, which I'll highlight, called Living in Harmony, with a picture of a human and a robot. So if we achieve AI-human harmony by the end of this hour-long session, it will have been quite a productive hour, I think. So of course, as many programs in a well-planned series like this should be, this session is intimately tied to prior sessions. There was a prior session on morality in AI. There's a prior session on opening the black box, without taking away from the really wonderfully nuanced discussions that they had in those sessions. And I encourage you to watch them. They're available through the Forever Learning website. In sum, those two sessions emphasize two very important themes that we're going to pick up on here. And one is that widespread deployment of artificial intelligence raises real ethical challenges. And the other is that those challenges sometimes derive from or are exacerbated by the black box nature of many of these artificial intelligence tools. If that's not a term you're familiar with, for Professor Frank Pasquale, who is a contributing author to our recent Law and Contemporary Problems journal, on black box algorithms and the rule of law, defines these black box systems as those that are, quote, colonized by the logic of secrecy. So in other words, these are the workings of these black box AI systems lack transparency and may escape our capacities for some intuitive explanation. Okay, so why should we be concerned about that? If these new tools provide us with highly accurate predictions and outputs, should we even care about black box characteristics or other ethical challenges? And I think, as you might guess, the answer to that, I think, is yes. And I think most of our panelists would agree. So in this session, which is called Behind the Machine, AI, Algorithms, and Bias, we're indeed going to focus on the concern of bias. We're going to ask how vulnerable are these AI systems to the biases and errors that come from their human creators. Bias can creep into algorithms in many ways. Professor Tantum soon will help us to understand, even at a programming level, how that might happen. But some expressions of bias may be more obvious or more stubborn or more pernicious than others. And so our panel is going to discuss the various ways that bias might be addressed within and by algorithms in AI systems. So before I turn to this really wonderful group of panelists from Fuqua, from Stanford, from Pratt, from Science and Society, from Law, I'll share that this concern about bias really raises fundamental concerns in the domain where I spend most of my time.
I cannot hear you. Where is everybody?
So at least in my domain of law, this raises really seriously fundamental challenges, as transparency can really undermine, transparency in decision-making processes. You'll hear from Professor Puria about credit determinations. Others might be housing decisions, access to public resources, and those are exactly the kind of places where we want to ensure fairness. It sounds fundamental. Fairness is a concern, and bias undermines fairness. So there's a growing awareness of this AI bias in these due process type of contexts. And it's in large part because of some recent troubling legal cases. Perhaps the most well-known of those is where a predictive algorithm that was used as part of a pre-sentencing investigation report, before somebody is sentenced after committing a crime, labeled a Wisconsin resident named Eric Loomis as high risk. And as a consequence, he was given a maximum 6-year prison sentence. He challenged that resulting 6-year sentence on the grounds that that the algorithm denied him insight into the decision. And key to that was determining whether the algorithm was gender biased. Well, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin denied his challenge, and the algorithm remained a black box because it was protected by trade secret law. But as this story made news, many of us in the law saw this as a wake-up call, and many outside the law did too. We need to understand these systems. It's essential that we do in order to protect not only our legal system, but many other systems from biases. So surely our multidisciplinary group of panelists here will help us to understand these biases in many domains, and perhaps even help us to see some potential solutions. So we're really lucky to have Professors Manju Puri, Phil Napoli, David Hoffman, and Stacey Tannen with us today. We'll have some time to discuss with each of them. For now, I'm just going to ask them to each provide a brief introduction of themselves, their roles here at Duke and elsewhere, and what some of their work focuses on, and some of their expertise in AI and bias. So Professor Puri, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So my name is Manju Puri, and I'm the J.V. Fuqua Professor at the Fuqua School of Business. So I'm in the finance area, and I do a lot of work on banking, financial intermediation, and fintech. And I teach a course on raising capital and fintech. And recently, I've done work on digital footprints and their relationships to credit scoring and giving of credit. So I'd like to show you a few of my findings from a recent paper that really pertains to this, first order to the discussion that we're having here today. And so this is on digital footprints. Now, what do I mean by a digital footprint? I think these days, most of us know that, that information on Twitter and Facebook is going to be captured by a lot of people, and perhaps we become a little more careful of what we put. And yet, we routinely access the web all the time, register on various websites, maybe without thinking too much about it. So how much information do we leave behind when we simply access and register on a website, right? And so I'm going to call that a very shallow digital footprint. That's sort of the bare minimum information that you leave behind when you go shopping on a store, for example. And so, and we're actually going to look at how much information this is. And I think the amount of information that you leave behind is probably going to surprise you. And that's going to have a lot of implications for us in terms of how this information can be used, in terms of the model that businesses use. As consumers, how should we behave? And as regulators, how should we think about this? So here's a picture that it's sort of a publicly available picture. And this is actually a map of Manhattan, right? And this is New York City. So if I was a woman from Mars, I know nothing about New York City. What does this tell me? So the red dots here represent people using iOS systems, so iPhones or iPads. The green dots are people using Androids, and the purple dots are people using Blackberries. So what does this tell me? There's been recent research that looks at what distinguishes the rich and the poor through the ages. It used to be once upon a time, it was, do I have BMW? Do I have cable TV? These days, it's, well, do I have an iPhone? And so you can see here, these red dots are concentrated in the island of Manhattan. That's where all the wealth is. Once you start going out to Brooklyn or New Jersey, you see far more green dots, which are Androids, or they're correlated with lower income. And in the heart of Manhattan, there are a few purple dots. What are they? Maybe like Obama, people who refuse to give up their Blackberries, or more likely bank issued devices. So, and this is only one variable that you leave behind when you access the web. And so, we made a list. We had access to an e-commerce company, and we tracked 10 variables, very simple variables that you leave behind each time you access the web. So first, how do you access it? Is it with your mobile? Is it with an iPhone? Is it with Android? Who's your email provider? Do you use a free Gmail provider or an old free provider like Yahoo or Hotmail, or a paid email provider? And as I told you, many of these actually correlate to income. And so by using that, you can actually correlate where does the wealth lie. Then this is, of course, interdisciplinary. So what about the marketing? How do you get to the homepage? Do you actually type the address in, or do you randomly click on links? So people who randomly click on links, their default rate is higher. So similarly, what about the checkout time? Do you check out morning, noon, or night? When do you think the default rate is highest? Well, people who shop between midnight and 6 a.m., they have the highest default rate. What about email error? You type your email in and it bounces, right? And so that gives you high default rate. So either you stole that email address, so, or you're so drunk you couldn't type right. Either way, it's not a good sign. And then what about the email address itself? There's a growing research in entrepreneurship saying if you name something after yourself, it matters. So if your name is in the email, either your first or last name, does it matter? Am I more likely to default if I have my name, or if I have something like Sunflower 007? Well, Sunflower 007 is more likely to default. And what about how I type things in? Is it all in lowercase, or like civilized people do actually capitalize the first letter? And it turns out if it's all in lowercase, you end up defaulting more, right? And so what we find is even this bare bones digital footprint, right? So we're not talking of mining, Twitter, Facebook, all the other posts that you may put. This is just, you're going to the web and accessing it. Even this bare bones digital footprint actually predicts credit default as well as a credit bureau score. So think of all the information in the credit bureau score. It's your history, all your loans, it tracks your payments, whether you're late on interest. And the digital footprint, it just takes a few seconds and it's doing as well. So what is the hope and the challenge? The hope is access to credit to the unbanked. There are more than 2 billion working age adults worldwide that lack access to the credit. Even in the US, by a survey done by FDIC, the unbanked are something like 6 or 7%. The underbanked are somewhere like 16%. And so digital footprints gives us hope that for consumers with thin files, with no credit scores, they actually work as well as with consumers who have credit scores. So now you can actually bank or start giving credit to the unbanked. And what is the challenge? The challenge is discrimination concerns. The Fair Lending Act actually prohibits you from using variables like minority, ethnicity, gender, geography. And so here, now in the digital footprint, could you, use other variables that are perhaps correlated and that will let you track this back? And might that lead to more discrimination? And so there's the hope and there's also the challenge. So anyway, that's my quick overview. And again, it's great to be here. I'll pass it on to the next panelist.
Thank you, Manju. That's brief, but also a lot. And I'll look forward to discussing that a little bit more. I'm going to turn it over to Phil Napoli from Stanford now. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. My name is Phil Napoli. I'm the James R. Shepley Professor of Public Policy in the Stanford School of Public Policy. And I also direct a center here called the DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy. And because I'm a glutton for punishment, I am also the Senior Associate Dean for Faculty and Research here at the Stanford School. But my research in recent years has focused on issues around digital platforms and their role in our news and information ecosystem. I teach a course pretty regularly in our what we call our PJMS program, or Policy Journalism and Media Studies program, which is our certificate program for students that want to go work in journalism or news media professions. I teach a course there called Algorithms, Journalism, and the Public Interest. And that course actually led to, here's the closest thing I have to a slide, which is this book, which I don't know if it shows up backwards on your end, Social Media and the Public Interest, Media Regulation in the Disinformation Age. And so I'm very interested in these questions around what kind of governance structures, regulatory systems may or may not be applicable within the context of these digital platforms that essentially do what we call algorithmic gatekeeping, using algorithmic systems to make decisions about what is important, what is not important, what is prioritized in our news feed, what is not prioritized in our news feed. Obviously, a topic received quite a bit of attention in recent years as we ask ourselves, exactly, what sort of role and impact and can do social media platforms have around issues related to misinformation, hate speech, etc. And when we talk about bias within this context, one of the things that is, we're increasingly realizes a point of focus is the way that these systems are, and bias, you may or may not agree with it being the right word, but the way that they prioritize, the best concept we can use for it is how they prioritize engagement, how they prioritize maintaining users' presence and activity on these platforms, and that sometimes that can lead to unintended consequences that strongly favor some types of content over other types of content. So we know, for example, that a shift in Facebook's algorithm a few years back towards content that generated more interactions, that is more likes and shares and emojis and things of that sort, had the unintended consequence of prioritizing content that was inherently inflammatory, content that got people angry. And where this becomes particularly important for the kind of work that I do here within our journalism program is that becomes a feedback mechanism that then influences the decision making amongst news organizations. And as research has shown recently, or as revelations in some of the Facebook papers that have been published as of late, even influences political parties in terms of what kind of content they choose to present on social media. What kind of language do they use? That essentially, that need to sort of optimize engagement, creating an incentive system towards more polarizing, more conflict generating content. So this is just sort of the tip of the iceberg of some of the issues we've been working on. And again, asking what kind of perhaps algorithmic auditing systems, or other models in other industry sectors that could be applied to this space. I, in particular, have sort of looked to an odd, perhaps, context, which is an organization called the Media Rating Council, which oversees audience measurement systems in the traditional mass media industries and in the online industries. But audience measurement systems have long been characterized as a black box, the way these sort of algorithmic gatekeeping systems have. And yet there's a system in place there where confidential audits are done to identify potential bias and things of that sort, that has had some, I don't think, hasn't been ideal, but has had some positive effect on making sure that the system for measuring audiences for television, radio, online, et cetera, represent all different categories of audience members accurately and reliably, and that there aren't any biases towards certain types of media consumers and away from others. So I will stop there, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks so much, Phil. I just want to highlight two things already. One, we're hitting on access to credit and finances. We're hitting on the way we receive news and information. I mean, these are very fundamental functions in our democratic society. And you can see why when we highlight bias in these contexts, it poses real challenges. So thank you, Phil. I'm going to turn it over to David Hoffman. I wanted to highlight, the second thing I wanted to highlight is David is the second of Duke alums that are on our panel today. I'm one of them, David's one of them, and as we'll see shortly, Stacy's another one. But David, do you mind turning on your camera and sharing with us?
Great, thanks a lot, Jeff. And so, yes, I am a Duke Law School alum and lucky enough to be back here as the Steed Family Professor of Cybersecurity Policy with my primary appointment at the Sanford School of Public Policy. I also have appointments at the Law School and at the Keenan Institute of Ethics and the Science and Society Initiative. I focus really on 4 different areas. I focus on cybersecurity, privacy, data governance, and platform accountability. Within that, what I do is look at specific use cases in different industry sectors. And for those, there are actually 4 industry sectors. That's healthcare, national security, impacts on gender violence, and then impacts on the ability to get access to information. And so with particular focus on this subject, the real issue is both that we look at in the technology policy lab that I co-founded is bias in the training data, bias then in the impact of algorithms, and issues created by algorithmic amplification of different content and the methods by which the amplification is implemented in different systems. That particularly comes from access to profiles from large amounts of personal data about individuals. And so we do a lot of work studying how that information is accessed. We have a project specifically focused on data brokers and understanding how data brokers get access to information and who they sell that information to and what that impact is on the individuals and what that impact is on democracy. We also have a platform accountability initiative. Within that research project, we're looking at what the governance frameworks are in different industries and asking questions about whether those governance frameworks could be useful for us to take components of and to think about how we would govern large technology platforms and uses of AI algorithms. Our specific focus right now is to narrow in on the governance frameworks that are in use in the environmental area, oil and gas offshore exploration, and in the financial sector. What we find in all 3 of those different areas is much more of a focus on what we call supervision and monitoring structures, and less of a focus on just waiting until bad things happen and then having lawyers start investigations and enforcement actions. So we are actually taking a look particularly for AI algorithms and to be able to determine bias. What can we learn from the different ways those supervision and monitoring governance frameworks are implemented that we might be able to use here, particularly in a co-regulatory way, instead of relying upon what we've primarily used in the technology sector now for 30 years, which has been a self-regulatory approach to governance. So looking forward to the discussion. And once again, for the organizers, thank you so much for having me here today.
Thanks so much, David. Not sure our organizers knew it. I'm sure they did, but what a nice order that we're in, because moving now to Stacy, you mentioned, David, about bias in the training data, thinking about the ways we build and develop these tools. And here we move to Pratt and Professor Tantum. Do you mind sharing with us?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Stacey Tannen, the Bell-Rhodes Associate Professor of the Practice in Electrical and Computer Engineering, where I teach courses in machine learning. I'm interested in incorporating the ideas of bias into our classroom conversations as part of teaching machine learning. So typically, teaching machine learning would be talking about the theory, the mathematics, even the mathematical assumptions that underlie the algorithms, but it often will maybe not pay much attention to other assumptions that go into those algorithms. So I'm hoping to bring into the classroom conversation ideas so that our students are prepared to think about how to mitigate potential biases before they're completely enmeshed within the system, rather than having to react afterwards to patch a system to remove any biases it might harbor. When we think about ways in which bias can enter machine learning, there's a lot of different ways that can happen. One way that's received considerable attention recently is through the data that's used to develop or train the algorithms. So what typically happens is, an algorithm is developed on some data, and then it's released out into the wild, and all sorts of data might come into that algorithm. And if we get new data that's applied to it that's different from what was represented in the training set, we then might find that decisions are produced by the algorithm that are kind of weird or maybe even erroneous. And you might think that erroneous decisions are problematic in and of themselves, as Jeff and others have highlighted. But the challenges that they present can be compounded even more if the algorithm's not transparent about how it arrives at the decision, if that algorithm lacks transparency and or interpretability. A well-documented example of this that I think had kind of come to media attention in the last few years is how early facial recognition systems did not work well at all for users with darker skin tones. But once we remember that these early systems were developed predominantly using photos of individuals with lighter skin tones, then suddenly that problem that was there is not necessarily all that surprising, because the data that was used to develop those facial recognition systems, they didn't have broad representation of all the people who might be using them. So I'm looking forward to a lively discussion from the varied perspectives of our panelists here today. Thank you for having me this afternoon.
Thanks so much, Stacy. So there are some themes already. And so I thought I would ask a question first, if you don't mind, panelists, that each person can respond to. The organizers of this series, I think, did us some justice by calling these real ethical quandaries. In other words, this is not just about small issues around the edges, but these are things that go to fundamental ethical concerns, fundamental components and characteristics of a well-functioning democracy, et cetera. So I'm imagining that there may be some people out in our audience who just heard those brief intros or have heard whatever's on the front page of the news and say, let's turn the spigot of data all the way off. Forget about it. Let's stop using these AI and machine learning tools. Let's not wade into these treacherous rivers and without the proper bridges in place, right? So I thought I might ask the question first, and we'll go back and start with you, Manju, partly because you framed it this way. You said, here's the hope and here are the challenges. And I'd love for each person, if you don't mind, to answer this question. Why do this, right? Why incorporate machine learning? What is to be gained? Because I think that there is much, and I think it's helpful for our audience to hear us. And how do you balance that against what is to be lost? How would you navigate that fundamental challenge that I think Manju so nicely framed for us? And Manju, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Jeff. I think there is just so much potential, first with all the data that is available, and second with the way that it can be used. And I know when I talk to people in financial institutions in Washington, DC or Basel, or, one of the great hopes is, can we bank the unbanked, right? So when we're looking at so many people who don't have access to financial services, who don't have access to things you and I take for granted, right? And it's not even how do you bank the unbanked, it's how do you give credit to them so they don't have to go to payday lenders. And so the hope is, and certainly what we find in our research is even people who do not have, your traditional credit scores, right? Which means they probably didn't have credit cards and they don't have all that history that can be tracked. You can still make loans to them using the digital footprint. And mind you, we're using a very shallow digital footprint. There are companies who have made it their business model using a deep digital footprint. So I'm thinking in India and Africa, they say, okay, give us your mobile phones. We take all that records and we track, and they find things like people who walk the same path every day, they default less. People who have large number of social contacts default less. People who call their mother every week default less, right? And they actually use this to make loans. And so these are people who don't get regular wages. And so this is the reason to use, all that wonderful data and the algorithms. And that is, can we do better? Can we do better by people? And what are the concerns? There are many, many concerns. I think privacy concerns have been raised the world over, right? Who owns the data? right? Is it the consumer? Is it the website? And then how do we behave in this digital world, right? In the old days, if I wanted a loan, you'd go to your bank, you'd sort of dress nicely to meet your lending officer. And, so unless you're Zuckerberg at Facebook, you won't go in pajamas and you'll try and get your loan. So now, do we don a digital suit each time we go online? Because people can sort of mine all of this. And do we have to be so careful? And is it the less sophisticated who will get taken advantage of, right? So we can tell people this, and but if you think of addiction, right, we know people who pull out their mobiles at 3 a.m. and they click on links and shop, they tend to default more. Now, once you tell people this, maybe they'll stop, but it's just like, we all know how to be fit and healthy, right? I mean, eat better, exercise more. Half of America is overweight. And so even if you educate people, maybe the ones who are really addicted, right, they're still going to pull out their mobile phones. They're still going to do that, and they're going to get taken advantage of. So those are some of the concerns.
Great. I mean, you make a compelling case for the divide that is emerging between rich and poor based on some things that maybe we don't come front to mind, right? About the plot map of access to an Apple phone, et cetera. And your comments there, Manju, really drive home the point that, calling your mother, I used this example in the Intro to Cyber Law that David and I co-teach just last week. My mother was very happy to hear that was a sign of creditworthiness, but might we be in a place where we think of the number of times we call our mother as something that speaks to our creditworthiness and therefore might be something we want to protect. It really involves a paradigm shift in thinking about privacy, as you raised, and we'll get to David and others soon to talk about those issues. Phil, how would you describe the why of this? Why what's to be gained?
Well, you said gained and lost, right? So interestingly, I think I'm going to use the same central concept for both, which is this issue of scale, right? If the context that I work in, as I mentioned, sort of algorithmic gatekeeping, and that applies not only to digital platforms, but how news organizations operate today. So much of what we're talking about has facilitated content creation and moderation at unprecedented scale, which, are there benefits to that? Absolutely. Have there been clear drawbacks to that? Absolutely. So I don't want to put this forth as one or the other. But just to give you an example, we've been doing some work on one of the largest networks of hyperlocal news sites that has developed across the US. And based on our tools that we've developed, I estimate that somewhere in the neighborhood of 80+%, possibly 90% of the content that they disseminate on this network of over 1,000 hyperlocal news sites is algorithmically generated. And by that, we're talking about data, oftentimes it's government data, new employment data, it's, different kinds of data that are released that can be fed into a software program that essentially generates then, typically at the state level, the same story using the data, or even at a more local county level, so that dozens or hundreds of versions of the same story can be produced using these core data and sorting them out according to the appropriate geographic region, and without a human journalist being involved. Now, in the environment we're in now, where we talk about and are concerned about sort of the future viability of journalism at all, this is where the interesting debate begins to happen, which is this a net benefit, or is this, or is this a system of producing journalism that could ultimately hasten the decline of human generated journalism? But these systems are increasingly being used, in this way. Which, again, for those of us who sort of have a long history in working in the journalism space, obviously raises a lot of concerns.
Thank you, Phil. David, you gave a list of ways in which you're applying your thinking and named some pretty important issues: health, national security, etc. Would love to hear your thoughts on kind of the pros and cons here.
Well, I guess I would potentially reframe the question. Being primarily a cybersecurity law and policy expert, I think the way I tend to look at this is, what are the risks if we don't try to use this technology to solve some of the large problems that we have in society? And people come out in different places there. You know, that question is a bit loaded. It somewhat presumes that we don't have other ways to address many of these issues. But whether that issue is cybersecurity, whether that issue is trying to combat terrorism, whether that issue is trying to combat climate change or provide adequate health care at an effective cost for more people on the planet, we have to note that artificial intelligence and machine learning has promise to help with all of those problems. So I tend to think about how instead do we think that we can go and try to explore realizing that promise by putting the appropriate controls in place that we know, based on what we've seen from advances in technology for the past 50 years, that as we look to use technology for good, that it is also going to be used to harm people and to enable the commission of a variety of crimes. So what are the right governance processes to put in place so that you can maximize the extent that you're using the technology in a way to solve those large social problems and minimize that risk of harm? And people are, I think, asking some really important questions currently, which is to say, are we ever really going to be able to do that and protect privacy? And I saw some notes in the chat to say that, and that has been a huge focus of our work, saying even if my primary focus is cybersecurity, we say most of the mechanisms that we want to use to advance cybersecurity, if we can't answer the privacy question, which is really important, then we're not going to get to the place where we can put appropriate controls and protections in place. And so I put in the chat a link to the work that we've been doing with US Federal Trade Commissioner Christine Wilson and her continuing advance. I actually think we can do that. And it's difficult to get laws through Congress, but other countries are doing it, and they're putting new modern privacy laws in place that focus on use restrictions, accountability, obligations on regulators to get in and to understand how algorithms are operating, and risk management structures to make sure that people are doing risk assessments for the way that they're developing and implementing algorithms. I think all of them hold tremendous promise.
Great, and on that hopeful note, it's worth turning to Stacy, who's in addition to the regulatory and legal side and governance side, thinking about building that governance into the tools on the technology design side. What do you think, Stacy?
So I think that there are a lot of concerns surrounding, the privacy side of it, especially when we start thinking about data aggregation. I reveal a few things to one website to maybe get like free fax service, and I reveal a few things to another website to get a free signature service. All of things that are now happening within COVID that we're doing fewer things in person. But in the fine print, a lot of those services will say that they will then aggregate your data with others. And it isn't necessarily clear how it's being aggregated or with whom it's being aggregated and what's going to happen. Once all these little tidbits that we kind of, give a couple things to everybody, but then once everybody has a couple tidbits, the big picture, it really can reveal a lot. I was kind of thinking about maybe, I think that our other panelists have done a really good job in highlighting these privacy concerns and these regulatory concerns. And I thought that I might focus on kind of on the more technical side and thinking about what are the benefits that machine learning can bring us? What are the things that machine learning can do that humans can't? Kind of a very classic example that we often will kind of show students when they're first being introduced to decision theory, some of the things that underlie machine learning, is that, if we ask you as a human to listen to a sound and tell me if a pure tone is present, or if there's no pure tone, it's purely noise. Or if we give you an image and ask you Is this just, speckle noise on the page, or is this other image that's embedded in it present there as well? The ability for humans to detect visually or, by hearing something that's a very, very low signal that's there is pretty poor. But yet these machine learning algorithms, they can detect things that humans cannot through the usual sensing, that humans have with our eyes and our ears. So I think there's a lot of advantages there, and that machine learning has the ability to detect things that we can't. And we think about kind of improving, healthcare outcomes for people. I was, just on a dissertation defense where a student was looking at the really, really hard cases for detecting breast cancer through mammography. And, applying machine learning was able to bring about improvements in, making that breast cancer diagnosis that was beyond that which radiologists were able to do just by their visual inspection of, the pictures they have from the mammography. I think so it has a lot of benefits in helping us do things that we maybe are not natively able to do ourselves. I think maybe a true danger comes about when we think about maybe the willingness that some people have to accept a machine learning outcome or decision just, well, it's machine learning, therefore it must be objective, it must be unbiased. And if they're willing to accept those decisions without understanding why or how the decision came about, I think that's where the true danger lies. Because one of the things that is just kind of a reality is that, whatever biases that might be present, whether unknown, undesired, the machine learning is inherently going to embed those biases when it's trained, whether it's through the data, whether it's through an attempt to replicate what a person would be doing when they were making the decision. Any biases a person might have in sort of saying, this is how we should set up the machine learning, that is going to be kind of carried through and embedded in the machine learning algorithm. But some benefits that are there is that machine learning may end up revealing some of these biases that we didn't realize that we had and that we were bringing to the algorithm development. As kind of part of that initial setup.
Great. I just wanted to highlight for our audience members, and thank you for that, Stacy. There's a good chat going on. There's some nice questions in the chat. Some of them are receiving responses already, so I just wanted to point people there. There have been a couple of questions about the role of private enterprise, about corporations. David alluded to this earlier when talking about kind of these ex ante versus ex post structures. Rather than waiting around for something to go bad and responding, can there be monitoring, supervision structures, et cetera? But some of the questions in the chat seem to be about incentives for private corporations to put the brakes on, to put limits on, or to, whether it's limits on use, limits on gathering, whatever it might be. And so, Manju, I thought I might turn to you first and see if you had thoughts on what incentives might be, what we might be up against, what might be effective in that arena.
Yeah, so I think, so in finance, of course, we say the incentives of everyone is profit maximizing, right? And so we should expect that companies would use the data to, in any way that they can to maximize their profits. Now that may be at odds with what we as a society would want, right? And I think this is where there's a very important role for regulation. And this is precisely why regulators debate this so much and why it is a thorny issue. Just as we have regulation in the regular non-data universe, right? So I'm thinking, so let me give again the example of lending. We have the Fair Lending Act, which says you cannot explicitly use, some variables. So, the place you live or your ethnicity or gender and other things in determining who you give credit to. And now, when you have all this data available, so you might have regulation which says, okay, even online, you can't use these variables. I think the bigger challenge is, well, I can't use those variables, but maybe I can use these 50 other variables interacted in some way on some sort of machine learning algorithm that would actually sort of get me there. And then how do I regulate that? Or, how do I put curbs on companies to do that? And so it's definitely a tricky issue and one that I know regulators are thinking a lot about. Thanks.
It's interesting. I'm gathering, Manju, from the chat that there's some skepticism. That's why I asked the hope question first, because I think many of us are leading with some skepticism. And so when you ask an academic, they will tell you we need data and we need to figure out ways to do this. But it's worth acknowledging none of our responses have been we found the answer, right? That's why we're doing this. And it's so nice to see nearly 200 people here and maybe more who are watching, who are engaging in these conversations to help us find an answer. There's a great question in the chat from Nike Lewis about whether we need a new kind of Hippocratic Oath. And I'm imagining somebody like Stacy, right? And I know you're not a doctor, Stacy, but I'm imagining if you were, you'd be teaching your students the tools of the trade. And as part of that, you would be overlaying on the way you engage with your patients and others, a long-held ethical framework that is sometimes summarized in, is of course more robust than, but summarized in the Hippocratic Oath. And I know that you've said before, so this is kind of a two-part question, Stacy, if you don't mind. You've said before that there's a new demand, right, for students to be asking bigger questions about the tools that they're building and their impact on society. So part of the question is, how has your teaching changed in response to that need? And what do you feel about Nike Lewis's great question? Do we need a kind of Hippocratic Oath in the technical fields or elsewhere? And is that possible?
Yeah. So the first part to what I've modified in my teaching is, in one of my courses, Intro to Machine Learning, we are very explicitly incorporating this notion of ethics. We're introducing ethical frameworks. We're presenting students with case studies that are kind of centered around machine learning to kind of keep it aligned with the course, but case studies. And we ask them to view these case studies through the multiple lenses of the various participants, the players in the studies. And I think the big outcome from this is students are realizing that, these ethical questions do not necessarily have yes, no answers, right, no answers, correct, incorrect answers. A lot depends on the perspective of, each individual who's looking at the situation. So it's really helpful for the students to gain that perspective and to recognize that somebody else might be looking at this differently from the way I'm looking at it. And since they're looking at it differently, they might come to a different conclusion. That doesn't mean that one of us is correct and one of us is incorrect. It means that we have different perspectives, and there's probably a great an opportunity here for us to have a broader conversation about what our perspectives are and how we can come to some sort of resolution where we both feel comfortable with the outcome. And I think can you remind me what the second part of the question was?
Whether you think it's needed and or possible to have some kind of analogous Hippocratic Oath in the tech development sector, or that applies to technology industries.
I think it would definitely be helpful to just in general have, everybody who's working in these sectors and probably many other sectors as well, to kind of just be mindful of the ideas that, we're creating things and somebody might discover a use case for them that's different from our intended use case. And maybe when it goes over into that other use case that wasn't what we had envisioned when we created it, there might be, some thorny questions that arise. So I think even more broadly beyond tech and saying that I think it would be helpful just in general for there to be this mindfulness that there are these situations that we should consider, that if we all could think about trying to do things in such a way that it brings the greatest good and, trying to mitigate against anticipated harms, and really thinking creatively and broadly about what anticipated harms could be. But recognizing that we may not be able to anticipate every possible harm, but moving as quickly as we can to resolve a new harm once we realize it's there.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've seen a lot of work done by various organizations, some of which people here on the panel are a part of, on developing AI principles in the same way that bioethical principles were developed with consensus methodologies earlier. But putting principles into practice is a challenge, and you're on the front line, Stacy, right, in doing that. And it takes time, and it's so, for me, so I'm so happy to hear that people are being so mindful, as you said, and thoughtful about it. I want to elevate a question or a discussion really that's been going on that Jess Hale posed. The way she posed the initial question was this: where's the discussion of duty and obligation between tech and citizens? There's kind of a personal responsibility aspect here. I think this is particularly interesting for two reasons. One, both Phil and David gave some responses to that, and I'd like to elevate that and hear from them both. It also, I think, touches perhaps most proximately with some of the algorithmic accountability work that they do in platform accountability, right? Because one of the ways that we as citizens are feeling so intimately tied to the challenges here is our engagement with social media platforms, the platforms that are disseminating the news that the DeWitt Wallace Center is looking at, those kinds of things. So do you mind if I ask this kind of tech industry citizen divide question and the role of personal accountability, responsibility, et cetera, that Jess Hale has elevated, in either Phil or David, whoever wants to go first. Maybe
I'll go first, I guess, and just do a bit of a bridge from the former question. I think a lot of what we're looking at in these governance frameworks is how to capture those kinds of incentives to think about the broader societal impacts from technology in legislation and regulation, and then how to do that effectively, not just so that it's law or regulations on the books, but that you actually have enforcement and a change in behavior on the ground. I thought the Hippocratic Oath question was equally good, because that you need more than that oftentimes. You don't have enforcement structures necessarily that are going to change to create a complete change in incentives. I think there's been some examples of things that we ought to look at a little bit more. For example, the situation where there were employees at both Google and Microsoft that invoked the Association for Computing Machinery's Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct to object working on certain projects, particularly AI implementations that could be used for targeting in weapon systems that could result in people dying. What would it mean if we took some of that work and started talking with the people who are developing the technology to say, what do these ethical principles talk about around the data sets, around bias, about the way that they're going to learn when they're in practice from particular implementations that only may be reaching certain aspects of society and may not be gathering data from people of color or people from poor communities that are across the digital divide and don't have access to the technology right now. Telehealth's a great example of that. So I think we've got some opportunities and some really good areas where the Academy and Duke University could really invest and make a difference.
Yeah.
I'll take this opportunity to share, it's part and parcel of the paper I posted in the chat, which was, I would say a couple of years ago, when I first formulated this, it seemed like a nuttier idea than it does now, in light of how things have gone over the past couple of years. But it goes to that question of duty and responsibility as it relates to digital platforms. And I've tried to develop this idea of these large digital platforms as public trustees. That is, as essentially the fact that they are in possession of these large aggregations of our data, essentially that they are in possession of what, in the policy space we would call a public resource. That is, we own to some extent our data individually, and then we can imagine collectively we own our data as well. And so if we collectively are making these decisions to grant these privileged few platforms access to these, to what become these massive aggregations of our data, that perhaps we could imagine a model that triggers, public interest obligations in the same way that within the, old media context of broadcast regulation, the fact that broadcasters are granted access to another public resource, the spectrum, which is technically, owned by the people. Could we imagine treating our user data in the same way, and that it compels, duty of care, particular public interest obligations that we could imagine articulating about how the data are used and not used, and which can, connect to issues ranging from privacy to, political micro-targeting and disinformation. It's, and again, I say all that recognizing that it's, and I've gotten that feedback plenty of times at this point that yeah, it seems a little nutty. But either I'm getting older and nuttier, or over time, it doesn't seem, quite as outlandish as when I first sort of cobbled it together.
Well, I don't think it sounds nutty, and I'm always encouraged by the creative approaches. And one thing that I think is a theme that's coming through is that, calling your mother used to be a thing that you shared with family, and now it is a piece of private information that is of value to business or is value to the financial sector for a very fundamental democratic point in the democratic society, which is socioeconomic mobility through finance and lending. That takes a paradigm shift, right? Similarly, maybe these platforms shouldn't be understood just as private companies with all of the tenets of a private company, but maybe as public trustees when it comes to our data, or as authors like Kate Klonick and others, maybe somewhere between in our First Amendment analysis, a government actor versus a private actor when we start thinking about speech regulation, et cetera. So I just wanted to highlight the extent to which this creative thinking is happening on campus, is happening here, is happening collaboratively among departments. It's really quite wonderful. David was mentioning picked up on the theme of the Hippocratic Oath, and I think highlighted the fact that the policy school alone can't solve this issue. The law school alone can't solve this issue. The electric computer engineering department can't solve this issue. It takes a collaboration in order to move us forward in this regard. So I just wanted to say thank you to all our panelists. This is a brief discussion on a set of really important issues. For those who are here, thanks for joining us. Please take a look at the chat if you haven't yet, because in addition to a few questions that I apologize that we didn't get to, there are also some resources and links that have been provided, and those may be of interest to you. This is an area of work that's going to be going on. I know there's one additional topic in this series as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe. And thank you, Joe, and go ahead and close us out.
Thank you, Jeff. And thank you to Manju, Phil, David, and Stacy. This discussion was so rich and really informative. We wish we had more time. But as Jeff mentioned, there were a lot of things shared in our chat, different resources. So I'm actually going to add those to our living syllabus. As part of the Forever Learning Institute, each theme has a living syllabus that you can visit throughout the semester in order to keep learning more from our wonderful faculty. I included the link to that in our chat. And also, for everyone's benefit, today's session was recorded, as well as all of our Forever Learning Institute sessions, and they're posted on our YouTube channel, including closed captioning, so that you can share the things that you've learned with your loved ones, or keep revisiting so that you can continue learning with us. Our next session is December 7th. It is titled Artificial Intelligence, Capabilities, Liabilities, and Responsibilities. And it'll close us out for the semester on this topic of artificial intelligence, real ethical quandaries. So thank you all again. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at the very next Forever Learning Institute. Have a good day.